In 1990, The Witches was released, which no doubt terrified many young children at the time, with many nightmares ensuing. Produced by Jim Henson and based on the novel by Roald Dahl, and starring Angelica Houston in the memorable role of the Grand High Witch, The Witches tells the story of Luke, a 10-year-old who lives with his grandmother after the death of his parents, where Luke's grandmother frequently tells him that witches are real, and tries to protect him from the terrifying ways of witches, along with the warning signs of how to tell if someone might be a witch, whom want to kill children and leave their souls trapped in paintings. Luke and his grandmother head out on a vacation to a seaside hotel, where it just so happens all the witches of England are meeting up to see the Grand High Witch, where she reveals her plans to turn all the children of the world into mice. But when Luke and his new friend Bruno are called out by the witches, they themselves are turned into mice. So Luke, now in his mouse form, must somehow inform his grandmother of the witch's disastrously evil scheme.
Luke! It was the Grand High Witch. She's in this hotel. Oh my god.
This movie is no joke, one terrifying kids film. In fact, it's a fine candidate to stand up against Return to Oz as one of the scariest children movies of all time. In fact, if The Witches and Return to Oz had a smackdown fight as to which one was scarier, I think it'd be a pretty close draw. So for my 4th Halloween special of 2018, we are going to explore a children's horror film, but one that's equally messed up and terrifying, as we look into 10 things that you may not know about The Witches. Let's check it out.
Bitch who dares to say I'm wrong will not be with us very long. The devil.
Number 10. The original ending was changed. In the movie's ending, after being trapped in his mouse form, Luke is finally restored to his human self when a bad witch turned good visits his home and uses her powers to change him back. This goes against the book's original ending, in which Luke was left to carry out the rest of his days as a mouse. Producer Jim Henson felt that the original ending of the Luke character remaining to be a mouse wouldn't work theatrically despite it working great in book format. So 2 different endings were filmed. One where, like the book, Luke remains a mouse, and the other version which we all know about, where one of the witches turns good and uses her powers to make Luke human again at his England home. Screen test audiences were shown the 2 different endings, Roald Dahl's original inspired one and the theatrical version where Luke becomes human again, and depending on which ending the test audiences preferred was to be the ending that would go on to be used, and it seemed that the test audiences wanted to see Luke human again as that was the ending that was preferred, and thus that was the ending that was used, causing a huge difference between the book and movie version. Number 9. The main character is a lost boy. The lead character of Luke was played by young American actor Jason Fisher, who would have been 10 at the time of filming. And, well, he pulls it off nicely and is believable, despite being an English kid with an American accent. And if you think Fisher looks familiar but can't quite put your finger on where you've seen him before, that's probably because you've seen the movie Hook, as Fisher played one of the lost boys in Steven Spielberg's fantasy movie about Peter Pan returning to Neverland after growing up and becoming middle-aged. Fisher plays Ace, who actually doesn't have a speaking part, but who knows, maybe he did and his lines were just cut, reducing him to being more of a background character to the piece. I always thought that it was weird as a kid, like why has he gone from being a movie lead to a background character? Well, my guess is probably because Hook went into production before the actual release of The Witches, but regardless, his performance in The Witches did actually impress a lot of people, as he was nominated for a Saturn Award for Best Young Actor. Before Witches, Fisher also appeared in Parenthood as Kevin Buckman. And in case you're not feeling old yet, Fisher is now 38 years old. Yep. And he doesn't seem to have acted since Hook, putting him in the former child star category. Number 8. Backstory of the book. Roald Dahl's original Witches was published in 1983, and just like the movie, along the way there were several changes made to the story. Well, according to the novel's editor Stephen Roxburgh there was. Originally the story was going to be called War on the Witches, and was a lot colder than the book ended up being, particularly with the Grandma character. According to Roxburgh, the original ending was actually going to see Luke return to his human format, but the idea of him remaining a mouse left the book open for a sequel. Yeah, who knows, we might have gotten a Witches too. Roxburgh also claimed that he and Dahl frequently clashed over word pronunciations, as Dahl was accustomed to using British lingo and Roxburgh was familiar with American terminology. A classic example of this is the fish paste sandwich sequence, in which Roxburgh felt Americans wouldn't be familiar with fish paste, and that it should be changed to tuna paste. Dahl got so frustrated, he said he won't have either fish or tuna paste. Wow, such a fuss and controversy over something really quite minor. Number 7, funny background extra. Oh boy, we all remember that terrifying scene where the Grand High Witch reveals her true self. No doubt to the shock and horror of young children who watched this movie back in 1990, where the High Witch literally takes her face off to reveal a grotesque one underneath. Oh my good gravy, was that scene terrifying! Nah, I don't care if I am now a grown-ass man with no hair. That scene still scares the Buster Browns out of me, I tell you. Well, you may have noticed something strange about some of the bald witches sitting in the background. If you have ever thought that some of them look rather manly, well, that's because most of those witches in their bald form were in fact played by male extras. One of them even being British comedy legend Michael Palin. And if you pause in some particular shots from the Witches crowd, you can clearly see it's him. And is it just me, or does Michael Palin look quite terrifying? Supposedly some of the other male actors who played the Witches were members of the crew. Number 6, filming location. Most of The Witch's first act was shot in Norway, but when the characters Luke and his grandma head to the seaside hotel, most of the movie was then shot in New Quarry, Cornwall in southwest England, particularly at the Headland Hotel, which acted as the hotel for the movie. In fact, as we all know, in the movie, Rowan Atkinson plays the hotel manager Mr. Stringer. At the time the movie was being made, the first ever Mr. Bean episode was also made, and I swear the jacket that he wears in The Witches is the Mr. Bean jacket. Look at that! Atkinson based his performance on John Cleese's Basil Fawlty from Fawlty Towers. However, while staying in the Headland Hotel, Atkinson had something of a Mr. Bean moment when he fell asleep in his hotel room with his bath taps running, which apparently flooded the place and even affected the crew's electrical equipment. Oh, Mr. Bean! Up to his usual shenanigans. Number 5. Grand High Witch casting possibilities. The most important part of casting when it comes to The Witches would have been that of the Grand High Witch. It would have had to have been played with a star with amazing presence, who could be both beautiful and terrifyingly horrific. Well, the original choice for the Grand High Witch was Cher, which I guess would have made sense as a few years earlier she played a witch in The Witches of Eastwick, and she does have a very powerful presence. But she turned the part down. Other actresses considered for the part include Eartha Kitt, Sigourney Weaver, Liza Minnelli, Faye Dunaway, Susan Sarandon and Linda Blair, all of whom either turned the role down or were unavailable. When Angelica Houston was cast in the role, Roald Dahl was very happy with the casting choice, which makes a nice change, especially after his frustration with the casting of Gene Wilder in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, as he wanted Spike Milligan for the part. So at least with The Witches, as far as the casting goes, he was seeing eye to eye with the crew. In fact, at the time of filming, Angelica Houston was no stranger to mild, family-friendly horror fantasy movies, as 2 years prior she was cast as Delia Deetz in Beetlejuice, but had to leave the project at the last minute. And then not too long after The Witches, she was cast as Morticia in the Addams Family movie. Number 4. Jim Henson's last film. The Witches had completed filming and was ready for release in 1989. However, Lamar Productions, the company that was going to distribute the movie, had collapsed. So Warner Brothers had picked up the project, but they held on to The Witches for an entire year before releasing it theatrically in 1990. However, The Witches' eventual release date was also blanketed with sadness, as it was released just 1 week after the death of the movie's producer Jim Henson. Henson was a pop cultural legend, having given us many great and wonderful things such as The Muppets and Sesame Street, along with his movies including The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. And his passing was terribly sad. There is some confusion as to what Henson's final film actually was, as some claim it was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, which was released in 1990. But The Witches, which also came out in 1990, was actually made in 1989. So it's easy to see why the confusion takes place. In fact, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, Secret of the Ooze, was actually dedicated to Henson. Personally, I feel like The Witches is his last movie because he was actually part of that movie's creative process and development, whereas with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, he helped create the designs and costumes and makeup effects. So, The Witches is his last film, but the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie is the last film he worked on. Does that even make any sense? Oh well, both movies are awesome films to bow out on. When The Witches was released, it didn't perform too well at the box office, despite positive reviews. But that's exactly what happened with Henson's previous 2 movies, and like The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, its true fame came from it being a cult classic, with those who grew up watching it having a fond love for it. Number 3. A Ghostbusters toy became an important prop. In the theatrical version of The Witches, before Luke becomes human again, we see his loving grandma trying to accommodate her grandson's new lifestyle needs, to which we see that Mouse Luke now resides in a toy house. Well, the toy house that was used for the scene was none other than the Ghostbusters Firehouse playset, that was released for the real Ghostbusters action figurine lineup. At the time, I thought that was awesome. When I was a kid, I loved the idea of not only living in a toy house, but the Ghostbusters Firehouse? Hell yeah! Although now I'm older, I wouldn't be so keen on it now. This choice of prop though really makes me wonder, did The Witches production crew have to pay a fee to Dan Aykroyd for using a toy which is part of a product that belongs to him? Or did a member of the crew just head out to a toy shop to buy a toy house and grab the firehouse without any royalties? I mean, after all, the Ghostbusters logo was removed. This seriously fascinates me. I would love to know the creative process behind this. And the plot thickens, as while doing research for this episode, I found this old behind the scenes footage from the special effects crew of The Witches, only to see a real Ghostbusters poster in the background, which makes me think there must have been some kind of deal going on. Number 2, there is a cut of the movie that is actually scarier. Ugh. There is no disputing the fact that The Witches is one terrifying children's movie, what with its freaky and almost gruesome visuals and disturbing child massacre plot. It proves that The Witches was setting out to be a balls-to-the-wall horror movie experience for children, which to this day has been a memorable experience for many who grew up watching this movie who no doubt were left with nightmares along the way. And if you can fathom it, at one stage the movie was actually going to be even scarier than the final cut that we've all seen. Damn, that's a lot of scary. The movie was directed by British director Nicholas Roeg, who in his earlier years had directed many strange and surreal movies, such as Performance, Walkabout, Don't Look Now, and The Man Who Fell to Earth. Roald claimed that the movie was originally a lot more terrifying than the final theatrical product, because he showed the original uncut version to his children and it absolutely terrified them, so naturally he knew that cuts had to be made. Wait, so let me get this right. The movie was going to be more terrifying than it already was. We were going to get scenes that were more terrifying than this, and more terrifying than this. Wow, that's a lot of messed up PG shenanigans right there. Number 1, Roald Dahl didn't like the movie. It seems clear that, like Stephen King, Roald Dahl has issues with some of the live adaptations of his work, despite the fact that he worked on the 1971 movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and despite the fact it was a smash hit adored by many and still is, he still despised the movie, and put a stop to Warner Brothers making the sequel Charlie and the Glass Elevator, which he had also written. Well, jump to 1990 with TheWitches, and Dahl still took exception over the theatrical treatment of his work. He apparently feuded with producer Jim Henson for changing his original ending where Luke becomes human again after being stuck as a mouse. Dahl felt that it took away the real meaning of what TheWitches was about, along with the story's true philosophy. Henson insisted that audiences would want a happy ending, but Dahl claims Luke remaining as a mouse was a happy ending, as the life of a mouse is an easier and simplistic one, and less complicated like that of a human.
Being like this might not be so bad. There won't be any more school from now on. That will be alright.
I see both sides of the argument. Luke remaining a mouse was meant to be symbolic of no longer having to deal with the hardships that are involved with being human, as opposed to the more easy lifestyle of other creatures. Whereas Henson was probably looking at the situation from a parental approach. I mean, after all, what parent would want their child to live as a mouse? Dahl was so outraged by the ending change, he supposedly drove around to cinemas that were showing the movie and were yelling out at people with a megaphone to not watch TheWitches. Dahl was also appalled with how terrifying some of the scenes in the movie were, and even demanded his name to be removed from the film. I understand the argument that is caused by the ending, as I guess it depends on how you want to observe the ending, as a child or as an adult. Because as a kid, I loved the idea of living life as a mouse and playing around with giant-sized toys. I thought that was a lot of fun. But now, as an adult, I can see the idea of a child being stuck to live the rest of their life as a mouse to be quite horrific. So it depends on which standpoint you wish to take to observe it. Personally, I don't want that one thing to overshadow the entire movie, as TheWitches is a great and enjoyable film and a great start for getting children into the horror genre. Anyway, I'm Minty, and apparently to witches, children smell like dog droppings. Ooh, I don't know what my excuse is. Ooh. See ya!